Hello, I'm Ted Seides, and this is Investment Management Operations. This show explores the inner workings of the most sophisticated institutions in the industry. Through conversations with executives across operations, compliance, legal, and finance, you'll hear how key operating partners run their businesses in an ever-changing and complex investment landscape. You can join our mailing list and access Capital Allocators content at capitalallocators.com.
I'm Scott McDonald, and I'm your host. My guest on today's show is Dan Ricci. Dan is the head of information systems at Prime Buchholz, an independent investment consultant and OCIO founded in 1988. If you're building or buying software, this is the episode. Dan shares how they built Prime Plus as an investment analytics tool that is used by their investment consultants and is simultaneously client-facing. This multi-tenant approach is a future trend in the software space, so keep an eye out. Dan shares his thoughts on a wide range of topics with regard to fintech. We cover going digital with investment committee reporting and when to leverage channel partners to bolt on third-party SaaS to your native applications. We then discuss the future of investment statistics and why he likes being an early adopter of SaaS, but also sees good use cases with later stage and mature technology solutions. And with that, please enjoy my conversation with Dan Ricci. Dan, thanks for joining me today. I would love to hear a little bit about your background and how you found your way to Prime Buchholz.
Thanks, Scott, for having me on. I really appreciate it. I went into school undeclared in business school, and my sophomore year, I went to a job fair and I noticed that most of the internships and most of the full-time jobs, entry level, were in finance. So being a fairly rational thinker, I was like, hey, I should probably declare finance since that's where the jobs tend to be. So it wasn't a decision that was really rooted in passion. It was more, hey, this is where I think I should go because that's where the opportunities are. So after school, I joined Liberty Mutual, and I was really excited and thankful to get a role at that time because it was a financial crisis. And I was within their corporate treasury department doing a lot of work with their liquidity pools. And within that position, I had some exposure to some project work related to database implementation with our treasury workstations. And I found that to be very interesting at the time, but I didn't really think of it as, oh, this could be a career path that I could build on. So I was still more in a finance-focused mentality. And then a couple of years later, in 2010, I joined Prime Buchholz, where I've been for 14 years. And when I started with Prime, I was a performance analyst, working with client accounts and making sure everything was good to go with the reporting across the performance book of record. And a couple months into the role, we were implementing our investment book of record. And I saw that as an opportunity, and I got very involved with that implementation. And within a few months, I was doing more of the business and analytics, more of the implementation work as a full-time role. And that evolved into workflow development and research management tools and things like that.
When did you get into the technical side of things?
After the investment book of record implementation, we then hired a research management tool. And that was my first real experience with leading an implementation more from a leadership position, not so much a following a process. As part of that implementation, I did a lot of work with data extraction from our legacy system, data normalization to migrate it into the new system and make sure processes were set so people knew what they were doing in the new functionality of the new database instead of the legacy processes. So that was a couple of years in.
And where are you now?
Now I'm the head of information systems at Prime. The department has evolved quite rapidly over the past few years. We started the department in 2017. There was just two of us. And now, since then, we're up to a team of about 17 people across information gathering and management, data engineering, and application development.
Let's give an overview of Prime Buchholz and the role that it plays in the investment community.
So Prime Buchholz has been in business since 1988, and we are an independent investment consultant. We do serve a wide range of clients, mostly in the nonprofit space across endowments and foundations. We have a lot of pension clients, a lot of high net worth offices and family offices that we work with. We have an OCIO practice. We have an implemented service model, and then we have the traditional consulting model as well. But we're doing a lot now with the data and analytics and reporting space too. So we're getting a toe in the water for technology as well.
And where has technology helped you scale your business?
I think it's a critical business risk if you take weeks to extract information to meet a client request or many days to put a reporting package together for meetings. It creates operational friction. The time to insight's delayed, and you got to be ready to go when people ask for information. So we've spent quite some time, years worth of time, really making sure our data is well structured and accessible via queries by the people who are doing SQL work, but also visually through things like Tableau for internal purposes where our analysts can access information and do whatever they might need to do to make a client-specific ad hoc report, or really get our information in front of clients whenever they want to consume it via our Prime Plus platform.
Tell me more about Prime Plus.
Prime Plus is our client-facing analytics tool. That's the combination of everything we're doing in support of our client base and within individual clients. So when you think about a traditional reporting cycle as an investment consultant with an endowment foundation, typically you get 12 monthly executive summaries a year. You might have 4 quarterly reports. You have some meeting dates in between there, let's say 4 big meetings a year with committees, and some ad hoc materials. But we're updating and collecting information from managers as it becomes available and processing the data as it becomes available. So the intention with Prime Plus is to say, how can our clients access the portfolio updates as new information comes available from managers without having to ask Prime Buchholz for constant updates? They can just log in to their Prime Plus platform and consume their portfolio data on a fairly real-time basis.
Most systems that it's actually you're the intermediary and then you're presenting that information out to clients, but you guys have built this differently so that the client actually accesses the information directly. That is novel. How did you make that decision?
The decision wasn't made in a single meeting where we said, hey, we have to build a client-facing analytics engine. It was a culmination of years worth of work getting this to the spot where this was even a possibility. So the way Prime Plus was really born was we had the ability, based on our data structures, to provide a daily estimate of portfolio performance across our client base for our consultants. So as the markets were moving yesterday, you log in this morning and you can see, just generally based on benchmarks, what we expected the portfolio movements to be across asset classes. And that was really interesting and helpful, though people have a long-term time horizon when we're talking about institutional portfolios. Given market movements, it is interesting to staff and committee members to just get a sense of what might have happened to their portfolio if there was a big event yesterday or within the past couple of weeks. So with that functionality being used internally, there was an opportunity for us to permission our clients to have that same type of information, which is something we would email them on a monthly basis on the first business day of the month. Here's what your estimated monthly performance is. And we were able to do that on a daily basis with Prime Plus and give them access to it.
And how do you handle private equity given the lag in performance?
We are processing calls and distributions as they become available and adjusting market values for those calls and the distributions. So we're just reconciling essentially to zero as a general rule to start, though we can do it against some benchmark to the extent a client will like us to do that. But that's the decision we make on a client-specific basis. And then as valuation documents are coming in, we're processing that as well and adjusting the market values and the performance as the new information hits. So what's interesting about this is when we're processing calls and distributions, not only does Prime Plus give the client updated valuations or estimates based on the call and distributions, it also makes the call and the distribution or the distribution notice available. And typically, those are available on the call side in advance of funding dates. So they can log into Prime Plus and get the document right here to the extent they're responsible for that call notice themselves without having to log into portals and get it from whatever portal the email told them to go log into.
This is really interesting stuff. So building this type of system, do you actually go out in the market and look at what was currently available from a purchase standpoint and then decide to build it?
It was an interesting process because we didn't set out with the intention to build it ourselves from the get-go. When we think about portals, typically it's document repository to start. How do you post documents online and how can a client extract those documents? And then many consultants are making their research available online, which is great. And we had some channel partners via technologies that would have enabled us to do the same thing. But our strategy was more about the portfolio data and how can I get all of the information we have about some endowment, let's say, available to that endowment. We view it as their information. We're tracking it, but it's really your data. So that didn't exist. And that was the starting point to say, okay, we have the data structures, we have the technical capabilities to bring something like this to market. Are we willing to actually pursue this? And the answer was yes. And we've been building in Prime Plus since 2019.
What was it like before you implemented Prime Plus?
So prior to Prime transfer process between Prime Buchholz to our client was hard copies. You're getting your executive summaries, you're getting your meeting materials, you're getting your quarterly reports, or we'll be sending you documents via email or loading them to our portal at the time. If it wasn't part of that standard reporting package or it wasn't part of meeting materials, typically that data may not have, or the documents or the K1s or the audited financials, whatever it may be, may not have been received by our clients unless they asked for it. So what we're doing now is doing our best to get that information into Prime Plus. So while they can still ask us for anything, it's more self-service where hopefully it's available for them within Prime Plus, and we can eliminate that step of the request and have the reliance become more on the Prime Plus side.
What's been the client reception based on this move?
It's been great. We have a couple of thousand of users on the platform now, and the use cases are wide. The most prevalent use case is our daily portfolio processing or estimate process. As new information becomes available, what's the estimated performance numbers across last month and month to date? That's the information that changes most frequently, and our investment staff and committee members are looking at that a lot. What's been interesting is we have so many logins on a daily basis. We've leveraged our clients as our products team. So they do have a lot of good feedback, and we're agile enough to incorporate their feedback pretty quickly, which does drive engagement with the platform too. And I think that's the best way to build product is based on the client feedback.
What's been the experience of the employees that are actually using the system?
It's the same platform that our internal folks are using as external. So actually our biggest users are our consultants. So our consultants are able to toggle through to any of their clients, whereas our clients can only see themselves. But what's really been a huge benefit is our consultants would not often log into the investment book of record and run their own reports and really dig into data. They'd ask for it. That's gone down by a lot by us making it available in an easy online platform. So they've been able to stay on top of portfolio data much more easily than in the past. And the second outcome from the internal side is that Prime Plus in committee meetings is often used as the meeting materials. And because it's interactive and we can answer a question quickly, it's really reduced the amount of follow-ups that come out of meetings too. We can just answer that ad hoc question from a committee member that maybe we weren't expecting, but we had the data available, which otherwise would have been tough if it was only hard copy reports.
Was there any tipping point where people, from an adoption standpoint, was there any moment that said, this is really powerful? I don't want those physical reports anymore. I'm going to log in and use this.
It was very interesting timing because we released version 1 in March of 2020. So Prime Buchholz was going fully remote and there was Prime Plus. And it was just, oh, this is pretty helpful to have some portfolio data available to me. I can't stop by anybody's desk right now and ask them to run some reports. So it was a positive outcome of the time where it was almost forced adoption because it was actually easier than sending someone an email to access information. This was like in the first version, the first iteration. And by getting most of our company in there early, we had adoption early, which then drove engagement. And that's when we were able to crowdsource ideas and really understand what do we want to see internally, what do our clients want to see externally, and formed the build process over the next few years.
So you're building this vertical stack. Are you doing it 100% yourself, or do you actually bring in other SaaS companies to help leverage what you guys are doing?
So Prime Plus is built in the Google Cloud. It's a serverless infrastructure, and every line of code has been built by employees at Prime Buchholz. So in terms of building the product, we've been doing that ourselves. We do have a lot of help from Google Cloud providers on things like security infrastructure and the like, which is really important. But in terms of getting data into Prime Plus and making sure that we are nimble and able to process efficiently, we do have many service providers we're leveraging like Canoe. So calls and distributions and valuations. The only reason we're able to do this at scale on a daily basis is with Canoe integrations. That's not reasonable given our scale to do that with a bunch of analysts. We needed Canoe to get in there and help us scrape these data points, put them in a normalized way, put the human oversight on top of this to make sure we agree with the information that's being scraped off these documents and then permission it to the client within a day. You
hinted at what Canoe does, but maybe could you draw that out a little bit more?
Canoe, from my perspective, is a great tool to get information. When I say information, I mean market values off of statements, transactional data off of statements, or scraping call notices to get dates, call numbers, the details of the call, the subtypes that might be associated with that call. The same is true of distributions and valuation documents. So instead of a human looking at a statement and typing the numbers into your IBOR, Canoe can help get that data off of the document into a structured format so you can load it into your IBOR at scale, which has been quite helpful for us. So we're at this point processing well over 6,000 investments a month via Canoe.
Is there any service element where you actually have to hand key in, or are you just QCing the data that's coming into Prime Plus?
There's still a human element. I would say we're about 70% automated by way of custodian integrations, or data passing through Canoe, but there's also so many one-offs, I'll call them more client-specific nuances that our analyst team accounts for manually.
Do you think the market will get to a point where you're 100% automated within 2 years, 3 years?
I don't think so. I think the market will become more automated, but there's just so much nuance in the way data is transferred between database A through to document, then to database B. I think the way the industry needs to pursue automation at scale closer to 100% is to remove the PDF. And how can you really structure data from database A to database B more directly?
Could you have a clearinghouse of information similar to DTCC or something like that?
It would be very interesting.
Maybe even take a step back from there. What about just the standardization of data formats, even if it's just PDF, to have a singular format? I know ILPA's tried to do this. Would that help?
I think it certainly would help. I think there's barriers that would exist in terms of adoption. Like, how do you get the investment managers to adopt one way of naming this transaction? And then how do you get the allocators and the consultants on the other side of this to adopt that same transaction methodology? To have that concept of a structured middleware between both parties would be brilliant. But absent of that, tools like, I'll go back to Canoe for a second, to take information to say, okay, this manager says this transaction type is one of these 10 things, but I'm normalizing it to this single transaction type that you're using in your downstream system. There are tools available in the space to do that today.
How do you keep pace with technology, just to be aware of what's out there, just in case you might say, you know what, this is a better tool for us today?
I think keeping pace is really hard, especially now. There's so much happening, and it's really easy to get stuck trying to chase the latest trend. So what I am pretty militant about for myself is being aware of the trends, really understanding, let's talk about large language models, what the opportunities are for LLMs, different GPTs, and how we could leverage them. But prior to pursuing a buy or an integration of new technology, I think it's really important to understand, what is my goal here? What do I want to get out of this? And how do I see myself and my firm using this 3 years from now? What's the implementation look like? Is our data structured in a way, or do we even have the data in-house to make this work? So really thinking through what our goals are and making sure we're structured and able to adopt something is important to consider as part of that process.
One of the things I experienced was there's always this concept of you want to be aware of what's out in the market. You want to look at something that's interesting, but you're not really in a position to buy. How do you manage that expectation with the SaaS provider?
I say exactly what you just said. I'm interested in your technology. I see a use case here. Here's how we'd expect to use it, but I don't have budget yet. Our budget cycle happens in November, so I'm pretty candid about that too. If I'm looking at something right now, I'd like to get that information so that when we're doing our firm-wide budget process, I'm equipped with the numbers that would be required to be approved in a budget. But often I've found that the SaaS providers are very receptive to that, and they appreciate the candor and not stringing them along, and just the honesty of saying, I'm interested in your product. I'm not sure I have the spend yet, though. And that usually builds trust between you and the SaaS provider.
What about your incumbent stack? How do you assess that A, they're doing the right thing for you, 2, they're secure, there's all these other components to make sure that they don't create an unexpected risk on your end?
Generally speaking, within the incumbent stack, we will spend time reviewing use cases on a frequent basis to say, are we using this effectively? Are we not using this enough? And if we're not using it, is this something we should consider terminating in favor and applying those dollars to something more useful? So that's an internal process. We don't really share that with our providers at all. And then the second tier of that is, can we consolidate? Do we have components of different things? And is there an opportunity for us to consolidate into one system? Or maybe there's a third system that can actually do both. and we'll sponsor a migration potentially at that point in time. But in terms of ensuring technology is secure and we're still with best practices, I do that and my team does that more as part of our normal check-ins. We have a lot of check-ins scheduled on a quarterly basis or maybe even monthly if it's newer, just to see how things are going, make sure we're doing our diligence, kind of like you'd be doing with a manager, just to stay on top of their security infrastructure, their product roadmap, and offer any opinions or feedback you might have.
Is SOC 2 something that you see prevalent with most service providers?
It is very prevalent, and it's typically one of the first things that we look for to make sure that that is in place.
If you get a report, is there anything you look for?
Things that we're typically looking for are their incident response plan, the data storage, backup, and disposal processes that they have in place. What's their vulnerability management plan? What's their disaster recovery plan? What's their response times and SLAs associated with that? So there is a lot of trust that goes into that. And I think when you have the conversations with the vendor outside of reading the reports, you can really get a sense of what they're thinking and how their security folks think about this and what the processes are associated with it.
Do you think about the back end of it when you're coming into a relationship, how things need to work? But let's say you terminate that relationship and they have your data. Is there anything that you guys look for that other people should be thinking about with regard to actually ownership of data that may be within their infrastructure?
If we terminate a relationship, we will receive our data in file format. We've done that before. And that file format is going to be potentially variable based on the provider. You hope that they are able to extract that in a way that makes sense, but that might not always be the case. And then we do confirm that that data doesn't exist on their servers anymore once we have terminated a relationship. Oftentimes, that might be something that takes effect 12 months post-termination. So there is a concept of disaster recovery there, where if you need to access something that maybe you mishandled on your end, it still exists or not. That's something that we've worked out on a situational basis.
I'd love your thoughts on the benefits of early adoption SaaS and later stage SaaS.
On the early adopter side, I think there's a lot of benefits, and that's where I tend to lean. I do have a preference for early adoption because my thesis is that newer technologies are typically pretty nimble. They're not riddled with tech debt yet and are often pretty amenable to your feedback by way of product roadmap. So I like working with early adopters or early technologies, but the risk is that you might have some hiccups along the way or there's going to be changes. And as they grow, there might be some growing pains. And I think you just know that going in and you work with them to make sure that the product works for you and for them. That said, I think there is a lot of utility to late stage SaaS. They're late stage for a reason. It's usually well adopted. And I think going into those conversations, my expectations are typically different. My expectation is that that is the technology. That is what we are going to buy. So as part of that diligence effort, let's say that gets me 85% of the way there. What 15% are we going to talk about with that late stage vendor? And likely I'm going to plan to accommodate that 15% on my side rather than on the early stage side. I might be able to get that 15% accommodated for me as part of a product roadmap item.
Is there anything in that space that's getting you excited today?
It's really interesting. Back to the trends. I think when you think about the large language models and how they're mainstream now, and then you think about our industry and how much unstructured data exists by way of documents, meeting notes, calls, annual conferences. It's an interesting thing to think about to say, how can we take that level of unstructured data and use something by way of new technology to structure it in a way that sits alongside the rest of my structured data for usage in the analytics space. So I'm excited by it. I'm still working through what the right use cases are, how I would actually apply it, what I'm trying to do with it, but it's something we're thinking about.
Some of the focus on just simple manager meeting notes. So if you think about the pain of the allocator business, meeting notes are probably on the top of the house, and there's inconsistency across different approaches because I'm going to take a note that's drastically different than the way you take a note. Maybe this creates some standardization of what to expect from a manager meeting note.
That is exactly right. We have a research team and they're meeting with managers all day and they're writing notes all day and they're going to read differently based on who's writing them and the interpretations might be different too. So I think having some normalization on top of manager meeting notes, A, expedite the writing process is really helpful. It saves time, but B, normalizing it in a way that the consumer of the meeting note and who's reading them, our consultants, potentially our clients, have a uniform experience. They come to expect what Prime Buchholz sounds like across notes. But as part of that process, if we're applying models to help us with that, it is super important to us to make sure we have human in the loop there. So we're not just passing data through some model without reviewing the output to make sure we agree with it and it's still in the spirit of what we were trying to say. So that's an important consideration too.
What are your thoughts on the current concentration in M&A activity within SaaS?
It's becoming quite concentrated. We're seeing a lot of consolidation, and it does raise some questions. I think why is one question. I know there's revenue capture and user capture is important, and I think there's a lot of potential for some of the consolidation we've seen between platforms. But you wonder, the acquired platform, what happens to that product? What's the evolution going to be? And are you stuck with something that is going to be frozen in time now? So I think that's where the new SaaS providers have an opportunity to disrupt, because when there's an acquisition, you're likely going to face some challenges as a user based on maybe the product's not evolving or maybe pricing is going to change. So that might trigger you to look out into the space to see what other options are available. Even if you're not that serious, you might just want to look. And that's a good play for the early stage SaaS providers to raise their hand and make sure that they're available to answer those questions.
Lots to keep an eye on. I want to talk a little bit more about where you think we're going with data and statistics and other metrics.
Our industry has a lot of structured data, and return streams are king, and exposure data is king. There's so much we can do with that to have structured data on a monthly basis, on a quarterly basis, and to do some really cool time series analytics with that. But arguably, there's more unstructured data by way of, we've been talking about meeting notes and letters and calls and everything that is associated with conversations and write-ups. I think what's going to happen is this gap is going to close, and we're going to have potentially just a structured data set with the unstructured data parsed off of documents or other. So how can we leverage that information alongside our return streams and our exposure data to get to new insights, to say, are the returns tracking with what we're thinking, what we're talking about? Are the exposures tracking with what our expectations are? And aligning those data sets together to really make sure that we're on top of things.
There's some dynamic data sets out there. You look at the NFL has next-gen stats out there. Do you think we'll ever evolve to something as novel as that with regard to manager selection and performance?
I think there's certainly a good opportunity there. And I think about, it's not necessarily a next-gen stat, but the stat QBR, which is a total quarterback rating that I think ESPN came out with in 2010 to rank quarterback performance. And you look at the lists on a seasonal basis, and it makes sense. The best quarterbacks are at the top, but I can't name a single person who can tell you what goes into QBR. There's 10 or 15 variables, and I don't know anybody who knows them all. And if I were to have to explain it, I'd be in trouble. And I think that's kind of the same thing with a lot of potential statistics, is if we are using new stats, can we explain it? And is it something we can really harness as part of the investment process? And it's tough if you don't quite understand what you're looking at to do so. So I think that's true. And then the second thing I would say is with next-gen stats in the NFL, I know they're doing a lot of real-time data tracking of players and their tendencies, and coaches can make decisions off of what their opponent's doing, or the training staff can look at one player and say, okay, this is all of their vitals and information about that player, and I can formulate a program for conditioning around this single player. And I think that is potentially more applicable when we think about our industry in terms of how much time is spent in committee meetings and how much we're doing by way of manager recommendations and ongoing monitoring and these write-ups to say, with the large language models and other emerging technologies in our committee meetings and our write-ups, to look at those historically and say, okay, what were we thinking about then? And 3 years from now, if we were doing that today, did that track with what happened? And can we get better based on ourselves and really studying ourselves and really extracting data from meetings and from documents to better ourselves, to make sure our decision-making process is good and look for opportunities wherever they may exist.
That's really interesting because you have this feedback loop with regard to how people behave, but I'm not aware of anybody that's actually going back and saying, at this point in time, we recommended this. Did we actually get that right? Obviously, you're thinking about the wins, but are we going back and looking at our process and say, where did we get it wrong? And then is there anything that we can do to actually revisit our process and change that to mitigate that error?
The manager recommendation process, a manager might go to our recommended list based on a committee decision, an asset class committee. Now it's a recommended manager. Now it's time for the consultants and our clients to evaluate that manager to see if it makes sense in the context of their portfolio by way of implementation. So those are 2 data points right there to say, all right, did we pick the right managers? Are we reviewing that? And today it's difficult to go back in time and read through the meeting minutes. It might be 80 pages long, and you might look at recordings and they're quite cumbersome. But then also to look at your implementation process to see, was there any bias there? Might there have been a better fit based on the context of this one specific instance? So I think it's important to review that process.
Yeah. For the most part, manager selection tilts towards the lagging, but if you can get it as a leading indicator, that's where the gold is. That's where you're going to find alpha.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anything else you're working on for the next iteration 2.0 of Prime Plus?
So I think Prime Plus is probably 5.0 at this point in time. We've had so many releases and it's grown exponentially, which we're quite excited about. But what we're currently working on today is private asset data. So how do we create transparency within the private portfolio by way of portfolio companies and the sector exposure, the industry exposure, region, country exposure of those portfolio companies and roll them up into a total program level. And then from there, how do we find cross exposure? This portfolio company might be held by 3 GPs. What's the fair value associated with each GP in this case? Having operating metrics available for each of those portfolio companies too. So I think having that private exposure, and I mentioned Canoe a few times, we're doing this in close collaboration with them. We're leveraging their technology to help extract this data from financials and quarterly reports. But to be able to take the private portfolio data and marry it to the public portfolio side to create more total portfolio exposure is quite interesting. I think answers a lot of questions. So that's step one. And then step two is how do we integrate that as part of our pacing process? So as we're allocating to new names, are we taking an outsized bet in, let's say, technology or healthcare that maybe we didn't anticipate based on our exposures on the public side too? So it's just knowing what you own and making sure people are aware of where their dollars are with every decision that they make. So I think that'll be a hit.
The private equity portfolio may be a little bit easier to generate because you're actually going to get some holdings, but maybe on the hedge fund side, how do you drill down and get some beta on that without really having a full look at what the whole portfolio looks like?
So in terms of getting data from hedge fund managers, what we're typically doing is it's still template in many cases where we're doing requests for information on a quarterly basis. And that will include things like sectors or industries and gross positions, short positions and all that, but on a percentage basis. We don't typically get the underlying names from each of them, though we will leverage 13Fs in many, many cases to get as close as we can. So by doing that, we do have a lot of information on the hedge funds. And it does help with the exposures, though it is difficult to integrate the hedge funds specifically into equities and potentially private equity from a GICS classification standpoint. It can be challenging.
How do you think about the 13Fs given the lag?
Generally speaking, it's best available. So though they are lagged, in many cases, it's the best available information at a position level. And it is at a firm too. So that creates another level of complexity. There may be multiple products or strategies. So we will work with our research team on the reasonableness to say that this 13F is something we should be using, or maybe it makes more sense to interact with the manager directly in a certain case. In terms of what else we're thinking about, where we're trending from here is how do we enable users to actually get data out? And there is data exporting features. But in terms of hard copy reporting, while I've been talking so much about online analytics, there's still a use case to get PDFs and reports available. How do we empower that process for our user base? And then the second thing, maybe tearing outside of the analytical space, is if we have our investment office staff in Prime Plus and looking at their portfolio data, how do we enable them to do their own notes and their own manager diligence and load their own return streams in and have that normalized against what we're tracking for them to have a singular experience across their investment process?
Well, Dan, I appreciate the insight and very excited to hear about what you've built. And I know that people who are pondering building their own system will be excited and scared at the same time, I think. I'd love to wrap up with some closing questions. And the first question I have is, what advice would you give to an emerging manager from an operational or technical perspective?
The biggest advice would be just consistency in when the manager releases information. If it's inconsistent, what ends up happening is Prime Buchholz and other consultants are likely just to email them a million times. When's it available? When's it available? And if it was available on the 5th business day last month and it's now the 10th business day the next month, you're going to have a lot of follow-up. So I think building expectations around when operationally information becomes available would benefit everybody.
When I was reviewing managers, one of the things I used to pay attention to was when the ADV Part 2 got delivered. And if it's all over the map, that usually was a hint at something.
Yeah, a little bit of an indicator yeah.
of bandwidth. And then the second question I have is, what is the one industry resource you most commonly refer to people?
Maybe the resources I'd refer to people aren't necessarily industry specific, but we've been talking a lot about data and leveraging data. How do you identify current staff who might have an interest in a potential skill set to really catapult you into new data opportunities? And ways you can uncover that is by having staff participate in data camp or something like data camp to really see if A, if there's an interest, and if there is an interest, B, start to build skill sets. Kaggle's another good resource. And then my second recommendation would be, and this is kind of out of the box, but for smaller firms who may not have a lot of staff or much time at all, I would say be smart with your interns. I think something we've had some success with is we've always recruited finance majors or people with an investment focus. But what about computer science? And what about the people who might have the technical skill set and have an interest in the financial components of it versus having the financial knowledge from a university standpoint and trying to apply some data science or computer science type projects? So I would say leveraging interns with a computer science background could be a real good way to get something going.
Well, Dan, thanks for the time, and let's stay in touch.
Thanks, Scott. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you like what you heard, hop on our website at capitalallocators.com, where you can access past shows, join our mailing list, and sign up for premium content. Have a good one, and see you next time.